Hi, and welcome to this new week in clinical engineering. We are continuing through our journey of trying to learn uh, uh, different kinds of medical devices, right? We want to look at a clinical problem and we want to see how technology is applied to that clinical problem. And what we want to look at this week is assistive technologies. Now, what is the clinical problem when we talk about assistive technology? And of course, the clinical problem, though it's very, very wide, in general terms, what we are talking about is disability, right? And disabilities can take different kinds of forms. So you can have, for example, visual disability, where people can't see very well, or you could have auditory disability, where you can't hear very well, or you could have motor disability, which means that you can't probably move your hands or your legs very well, and you need some kind of assistive technology to do various things. Now, people have thought about disability quite a lot, okay? And disability is not just a medical problem, right? Of course, it starts with a medical problem in the sense that there is something, something that is not all right, but it's also a social problem. Okay, let me give you an example. Um, let's say you cannot you are disabled and you cannot walk and you use a wheelchair, right? And if you're a wheelchair user and you live in the UK and you wanted to travel from one place to another, it wouldn't be very difficult to do that. I'm not saying that UK is perfect, but it's not very difficult, right? So, for example, in London, you can see that as you're walking on the footpath, when you reach a road crossing, the footpath actually slopes down to the level of the road. If you are wanting to take a bus, the uh, the bus frame can actually go down on its wheels so that a wheelchair user can get into the bus. Tubes are wheelchair friendly. Many of the tube stations have lifts, so and therefore are disable friendly to wheelchairs and people who use wheelchairs. Right now, at the same time, if you were in India, where I come from, that would almost be impossible. I lived in a small town in India called Vellore, and uh, even as a normal person with where I can use my legs, I some of us used to find it very difficult to get into the bus because the steps of the bus are so high. Okay, if it's an elderly person, they used to really struggle to get into the bus, leave alone a wheelchair user. So already you can see how the medical problem interacts with the social problem to create disability issues, right? So it depends. So the manifestation of disability as disability depends on the context, the society at large, the structures that we have set in place so that it becomes a problem. Now, take another example. In almost all crossings in the UK, you have uh, red lights that have auditory sound and where you can feel when the light goes green or and when the light goes red, right? That's really a taking away a little bit of the problems that are faced by visually impaired people. Does that make sense? So, disability, so to summarize the discussion, disability is not just a medical problem, it's a medical problem situated in a social context, right? Okay, good. So, let's carry on. So, what is assistive technology then? So, one definition which I have put on the slide here is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified, or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of individuals with disabilities. So that's what assistive technology is. Now, notice it can be very different kinds of things, right? Any item, piece of equipment, or product system, it could be commercially available, it could be modified or customized for that particular person, and there are various ways in which this can be used with people who have disabilities. So, for example, it could increase their functional capability, it could improve their functional capability, it could maintain their functional capabilities, right? So that's assistive technology. uh, so what we are going to do in this week is we are going to look at assistive technology through a grid. And this grid, or this framework that we are looking at assistive technology through, is called the Human Activity Assistive Technology Model, or in short, HAT, HAAT model. Okay, and the reason why we are looking at assistive technology through this grid is because when you look at assistive technology, it's not just the technology that is important, right? In fact, probably the technology, you don't want to first think about, oh, I have this technology, and then start to look at what the disability is and what the person wants to do. Okay, what you want to start off with is the human need. Who needs a solution, and what is the problem that that person is facing, right? So for example, you could say, well, this person cannot walk because of, let's say, a spinal cord injury, and therefore, so that's the problem. Okay, that's the human part of it, that's the medical problem, that's something that's happening to your that is deviating from the normal functioning of the human body, right? It could, and we've only talked about sensory and motor disabilities, but you could have cognitive disabilities, which is we have only talked about motor and sensory disabilities till now, but you could have disabilities like cognitive disabilities, right? Which is becoming more and more prominent as people have started living longer. And so our elderly people, especially, have these cognitive disabilities, which we want to help them with, right? So that's the human aspect of the HAT model. Now, it's not just enough to have um, an understanding of what is the disability itself, but it's also important to know what is the activity that the person wants to perform, right? Because sometimes we tend to think that, oh, here's a person with a disability, and what we want to do is we want to give them some technology that would enable, that would completely take away that disability. But maybe that's not what a person wants. All a person wants to do is one specific task. So, for example, let's think of a frail elderly person living on his or her living by his or herself in a house, and because they are frail, and their house has switches that need a reasonable amount of force to push on and off, they are not really able to, they struggle to put a light on or a fan on or something on. Okay, and they say, well, I am quite independent and I can do almost everything that I need to do on my own, other than this one activity of switching on the lights. And maybe the solution then is to just replace those switches, those mechanical switches, with a touch switch, and you're done, right? So we have looked at the human aspect of the problem, which is what is the disability itself, and then we are looking at the activity. What is the activity that that person wants to do, right? That is absolutely important to understand before we can give them a tool. Because if you give them a too complicated tool, maybe they won't like to use it, right? We want to meet the needs of the persons that are involved there. And having understood the human aspect of the problem and the activity aspect of the problem, we come to the assistive technology, right? We want to allow this person who has this problem to do this particular activity, and we use assistive technology to help them do that. And all this happens in a context, right? It's not just flying in space, but uh, the people are doing what the activity in a specific context. And we'll look at various things about this context. Before we move on, let me just tell you a story. So, when I was doing my PhD, I was in a hospital in India, and I was working in the bioengineering department in rehabilitation engineering. So, we had this young girl come in uh, to us to get some help. Now, this girl, when she was very young, so when she was around 3 or 4 years old, she had touched a live electricity wire. Now, by live, I don't mean the home wire, but the live a transmission electricity wire, which carries something like 40,000 volts or something. So she had touched it, and because of that, both her arms had burnt, and therefore she didn't have both hands. Okay, and when she came to us, we said, okay, well, I was doing my PhD in prosthetic hands, and I said, well, we can give you a prosthetic hand. We'll give you a prosthetic hand for both hands, so that it replaces the hands, and you can just do, well, hopefully, I mean, it won't replace. Our hands are not as good as normal hands, but they are something, and you can use them, right? And we tried doing that. We worked for months to try to fit her. She trained on the hand, she tried to use it, and all that. And finally, she said, I don't want this hand. It's too heavy, it's too difficult to use, and it's taking me too much effort. Uh, and she said, see, here's my thing. I'm young. She was around maybe 17, 18. I want to go on dates with boys. And the problem is, if I go on a date and a boy sees that I don't have hands, they are freaked out. Okay. Once they get to know me, they are all right. But initially, they just don't know what to do. So all I need is some kind of, just give me some kind of hands, even if they don't move. That just make me look normal. Just look normal, right? So here's the human aspect. The human aspect was that she had a bilateral amputation. She didn't have both her hands. The activity that she wanted to do was go on a date, right? And all she needed was to look normal, right? And so she didn't want all the complicated hands with controls and EMG and all those kinds of stuff. She had a very simple requirement, and we gave her those hands, and she's very happy, right? And maybe at a later point she says, well, I need the hand to do something else, and maybe at that point you give her additional assistive technology, but at that point, that's all she wanted. So uh, all this to say that it's very, very important not to get carried away as technology people, as technologists, as engineers who are acquainted with technology, but listen to the human, look at the human problem, look at what the person actually wants to do, look at their context, and give them appropriate technology. Great. So let's carry on. Uh, okay. Okay, so what kinds of contexts are we talking about? In terms of context, we are looking at the physical context, where the person lives, what do they do, where do they move around. We're talking about the social context, who they live with, the cultural context, what kind of a culture is this? Is it disabled friendly? Those kinds of things, and institutional contexts. Who's going to pay? Where is she going to get this assistive technology from? And those kinds of things, right? All those play into whether you can give a person assistive technology. On the human aspect, as we said, there are different things that the person can have. You can have motor disabilities, sensory disabilities, cognitive disabilities, affective disabilities, and there are also things like Are you a novice user of assistive technology? Have you just started using assistive technology? Or have you been using assistive technologies for a long period of time? Are you an expert in using assistive technology? Now, that would also change whether the person is, what kind of assistive technology you suggest to the person. On the activity end, there are various kinds of activities that people may want to do, right? Activities could be cognition. You just want to understand things probably a little better, maybe communicate. You may want to manipulate things, or you may just want to move around. Okay, so those are some examples of activity. And when it comes to assistive technology, we have to think about various things, right? You want an interface between the human being and the technology. You want a processor, which is basically the intelligence of our assistive technology. And in some cases, the intelligence is basically nothing. But in many cases, there's a lot of intelligence built into assistive technology. Then you want an environmental sensor, a sensor that can look at the environment and provide appropriate help. And you want an activity output. So that's what consists of assistive technology. And that's what we've put it in a diagram here, right? So you have the human technology interface here, uh, which is interacting with the human being here, the human element of the person, the problem, right? That's how the person interacts with the technology. You have the processor, which is the intelligence, which takes input from the environmental sensor and gives an activity output. And that activity output basically helps to fulfill this activity. And that's how assistive technology bridges the gap between a human being and the activity that he wants to perform. Hopefully that makes sense. In the next few videos, we are going to look at specific applications of HAT model to specific disabilities that people could